Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And I'm delighted to have Adam Horne with me today. Now, Adam's from OpenOrg, which is all about creating transparency and trust within your organisation. And I can't help feeling in these sort of tense political times that there's a bit of a crisis around transparency and trust in the wider population in terms of politics. But we don't want that to spill over into our organisations. And certainly, Adam, you saying there is a bit of an issue within businesses today in terms of this, and we want to dig into this. Adam, let me hand over to you just to introduce yourself and what OpenOrg does.
Thanks, awesome to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, and absolute pleasure. We launched OpenOrg last year, myself and my co-founder John, in 2023, and we did so because we both have 25 years combined experience in what we might call sort of culture change, but also building companies ourselves as founders, and also advising companies anywhere from 10 employees to 100,000 employees on culture change. So we've seen this ourselves for a long time, the issues that are created around lack of transparency, lack of trust in organizations, and we believe there's a way to fix it, which is exactly what we're building with OpenOrg. So we are very high level, we're a member network, typically for people and HR leaders and also their companies to come together to learn about how they can safely harness and use transparency to build more trust within their organizations, to improve also things like engagement, communication, how people share information, and ultimately how people get aligned to the business.
Great. Okay. And obviously we'll put links in the show notes if people want to know more about what you do. So first of all, I was thinking, is there actually, what's the evidence, I suppose, for the fact that there is a crisis or there is an issue with transparency and trust? Because I'm thinking I've worked with and in companies where there's probably been quite high trust and where there's been the opposite. And, it is cultural in many ways. But what my impression from hearing you speak before is that actually this is getting worse. There is a bigger problem than there used to be. Can you tell me a little bit about what the evidence is for that?
Yeah, I think it's been talked about for years. You look at things like engagement's always been talked about as being at an all-time low for a long time, but something like somewhere between 15 to 18%, I think, of global employees are seen to be engaged at work, if you look at recent studies. So that varies country to country, but it's not a great figure to look at when you look at how engaged and happy people are in their roles. But that spills over into trust as well. There is a recent study released by PwC looking at trust at work, and there were two big things from that really caught my eye. Number one was 67% of employees don't trust their employer. That's a huge majority. It's over 2/3.
That's massive.
Yeah, it's a big number, and in some ways won't be shocking, but in some ways is as well. But the other one that
they don't trust, though, do they? I mean, is it anything specific that they don't trust, or is it a range of things that people don't trust?
That figure itself, I think, is more of a sort of a general sentiment, I suppose, of do they trust their employer, generally speaking, rather than anything too specific. But the scariest one for me that jumped out, that points to organizational health or lack of, I suppose, is the one that I saw was 44% of C-suite don't trust each other as peers. So if you look at the leadership within a business and almost half of them don't trust their peers, it just shows you how dysfunctional leadership teams can be. And that cascades down. So if not aligned at the top, if you're not on the same page, if you don't trust each other, that's not going to enable the rest of the business to trust each other as well. So that was a really scary one.
Yeah, and I can see how that links to engagement, because usually there's a question, isn't there, about senior leaders can be trusted or to do what they say, that kind of thing. So it just seems quite, again, I think it does correlate with politics in terms of there's just people are really cynical about things generally, it seems, which is worrying in terms of discretionary effort and what people are going to put in, because they don't believe. It'd be interesting to understand what exactly they are cynical about, actually, isn't it, as well?
I think people feel lied to in a lot of ways, and actually where I've seen it in my career more so is I'm not a traditional HR practitioner. My background was more in talent and recruitment, and then moved into founder role for 9 years building companies. But my time seeing that intersection between people going from being candidates to employees has been really interesting. And there's another study that blows everyone away when they hear those stats, is a resume builder study that came out not too long ago that revealed 4 in 10 hiring managers have admitted to lying to candidates during the interview process about culture, about role expectations, about what they need. People are rushing to try and capture talent in this war for talent. That phrase gets thrown around a lot, and they do what they can to get people in, and that leads to really other scary facts, like 30% of people leaving in the first 90 days of a new role. So you speak to anyone in the job searching process at the moment, that candidate experience piece is a real problem to people, and ghosting and everything else that gets talked about. There's a lot of bad feeling around that, even pre-joining a business, and it erodes trust even before you've joined that company on day one. Then you have things like having to negotiate salaries and have tough conversations when companies aren't transparent about that. So you end up starting on day one already with this erosion of trust. And then when you find out that things aren't quite what you thought, that causes a lot of deeper problems, as you settle into your role.
I mean, the whole sort of losing, you've got to, common sense says it's counterproductive. You're going to get found out and people are going to leave. That makes it very expensive, doesn't it, in terms of recruitment? And is there a difference in the levels of trust or cynicism based on the size of the business or the sector, like public versus private? Is there any differences?
Not that I recall from the study, if I'm honest. One thing more on a personal level that's struck me sometimes is that larger companies can sometimes take a little bit of flack for their culture, which it can be harder to manage and nurture as you grow bigger and bigger, and you could become trickier to turn that ship around, as it were. It's much slower moving, but actually, from my experience as well, despite some of the flaws and imperfections you'll see there's some really positive things that larger companies, and particularly public sector companies, do that a lot of private sector companies don't. My experience has been that public sector actually does really well when it comes to things like pay transparency and salary transparency, for example. Very, very easy to see what grade and level and band people are on. Yeah, and that's something that private companies actually do pretty badly at, to be honest with you. So it varies from my own personal experience, but there's lots of positives that public sector and larger orgs actually do have, that probably because they have bigger resources, larger people teams, very specific reward, compensation, benefits teams that can focus on these things as well.
Yeah, and I think when I've been employed by a large blue chip, I would expect them to keep the promises. I mean, at the end, you're talking about the culture of a big business. There will be micro cultures, and it is going to depend on your line manager at the end of the day. So I can see why it may feel different when people arrive, but fundamentally, you wouldn't expect them to change things, to go back on what they've offered and things to be very different and have to negotiate. So I'd be surprised if that has got worse in some of the really big companies, because you think the processes would be quite nailed down. The other thing that occurs to me is thinking about in smaller businesses, how important it is therefore the style and the behaviors of the CEO or C-suite. Basically, are you building trust, or are you acting in a competitive way? Is it a kind of collaborative environment, or is it competitive? And that will flow down so much more in a small, like an SME, isn't it? It's going to be extra powerful.
I've seen this more so in smaller companies, but that I am definitely biased, and that's where my bubble's been for most of my career, is operating in that sort of 0 to 500 type mark, and I've grown my own company as a founder from 0 to 100 as well. So I've seen that the challenges that you face as a founder along the way too. But things change very, very quickly. So I think from my perspective, it's not always intentional, but what you might be selling, as it were, to someone joining your business as a certain culture or way of working, or EVP, might have been true a few months ago. But if you don't nurture that and stay on top of that and manage that, it can very quickly change. Naturally, it evolves. And what I see is companies selling something that actually was relevant 3, 6 months ago that maybe not be relevant now, and it's not always intentional, but it is lazy, and it's a lack of interest in staying up to date with how my business is changing and what that looks like now, and what we can offer people now. So it can be really damaging.
So when you say you see that more in sort, what do you see? You see lower transparency in smaller businesses. What do you, in the businesses you work with? What was it you're
It's more a misselling of culture, whether that's intentional or unintentional. It's, hey, this is what we are and who we are and how we work. And that is relevant for a while, but it can change very, very quickly in a small startup, scale up, or SME type environment. And as that team grows, that role of founder or CEO or whoever's at the top changes drastically as well. On day one, you're very hands-on, you're there all the time, you don't need to worry about communication or layers or levels. But as you scale and go from 20 to 50 and then 50 to 100, all of a sudden your day-to-day role, your presence, your communication changes. You create leadership teams, and that creates silos, and people feel left out. And so it's a really, really interesting space to be, because it changes very, very quickly, and it's not intentional. But if you're not careful, that trust, that communication, that engagement changes very quickly in a smaller SME and startup space.
I can totally see why that is as well, because in a smaller environment, one person, the dilution factor is lower. So bringing in a really powerful personality with a different tempo, that can have a disproportionate impact in terms of positive or negative, right? The other thing I think with SMEs or fast growing, your startup scale ups, that kind of organization, is you might be selling the vision. So we're fast moving. The reality is we need to set our process. We've got no processes, and we're running to catch up. So you're kind of saying this is what we're trying to do. Maybe overstating where you want to be, and that's why you want the person to come in and do that. And they come in and go, oh my goodness, this is so far from what you described. And it's interesting because I think it's almost a responsibility of a smaller business, is to, well, any business, it was to be realistic about where you are and what the experience is for somebody to come in and go for the person who's the right for you at the stage you're at, too, because not everybody can deal. I remember we had someone in our business who is a process person. It's a great process person. Well, you know what? We're still at the stage where some of the processes need to be defined, and that just messed with her head. She couldn't do it. So it's actually, we want processes. We want process people at this stage. We need people who can help build processes, as opposed to someone who needs them there. So there's things like that where I suppose as recruiting, we've got to be aware of not intentionally lying to people, but actually understanding where our culture is currently and what fits within it. So I guess that's trust.
There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in that space, and part of it is, for me, is lack of resource, lack of time. And I see this particularly in the HR and people space. Most of the companies that we work with at OpenOrg tend to be at the smaller end of the scale. You tend to be a lean or lone HR people team of one, maybe two if you're lucky. They don't have any time. There's much as there's this will to be proactive and have to put things in place around pay, performance, career development. Nothing's usually in place for a long time, and you end up spending a lot of your time fighting fires, and fires that maybe could be put out by other people like line managers and so on and so forth if the right things were done. So there's a mismanagement piece there. There's also a lack of investment in headcount within the people in HR function, I believe, that could really, really help to get these things in place sooner.
Yeah, interesting, absolutely. So it's one of those, it's a poor relation quite often. And also sometimes it's not, you don't necessarily have the right person. So it might be a part-time role. So that person is really having to, as you say, firefight, spin a lot of plates, being reactive, whereas this is quite proactive, isn't it? Thinking about establishing these sort of things. And I guess we're going into solutions here. That's my guessing at it. But what you're saying basically is there is a crisis in terms of transparency. Evidence out there that says it, and solving it, there's massive benefits to that sort of engagement related benefits. So higher performance, retention, talent retention, that kind of thing is what we're looking at. So what do you recommend in OpenOrg to address this problem?
We've obviously leaned heavily into transparency as the way to solve a lot of these things. And when we say transparency, that can cause leadership teams typically to tense up a little bit. So one thing transparency is not, for us, which we try and get very clear on, is it's not extreme. It doesn't have to mean that we're asking CEOs to suddenly open up everyone's salaries and bonuses and share them with the world. We're not saying you have to suddenly share all of your board minutes and every second of your conversations behind closed doors with the world. And we also appreciate that there's a lot of compliance and legal situations that can't necessarily be shared with people. That's completely okay. What we refer to really is communication. How can we improve communication flow within the business and outside of the business as well, so that people understand what they're going to be getting? And we talk about that in the wider sense of being open, being transparent, which we see a lot of particularly tech startup scale ups really embracing now, and a lot of very progressive CEOs starting businesses wanting to do in the right way. And for us, that touches on a number of different things, but it looks at candidate experience in particular. So what are we doing to communicate our culture, our flexibility, our career development opportunities, our compensation and EVP, etc., externally pre-hire, so we can give people as much information as possible, not just to opt in, but also to opt out if they want to. And that creates a lot more health in that general hiring process. And it means that when people join your business, they're fully aligned to what they're going to get and what they need to give as well to thrive and succeed in this organization. And too many people don't have that information to make an informed decision before hire. So that in itself will create a lot of health internally in your culture, but we still heavily look at the people experience as well, helping companies to better document how they deal with performance appraisals, pay, career development, how we look at DEI beyond performative measures and words and so on and so forth. Scary things like working hours and where we work from. People just don't seem to have a handle on that as a business. So many employees are confused about when and where they're meant to be working from, and it should be such a simple thing. So our focus really is from a journey perspective, really getting companies to think about what level of openness or transparency they want to have, and it's okay to have this scale there that fits your culture, your values, your ways of working. And once you've achieved that, then thinking about how do we document that, communicate that internally, get that embedded and lived and breathed, so that our team operate in a good way around that. Once we've done that, then you can start externalizing it and telling the world how you work without it being misaligned.
And I can see how that communication, formalizing clarity, it's basically clarity and consistency, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because as you grow, things are done differently, not intentionally. So nailing that down, I can see how that is really key for it's the baseline, it's the benchmark for preventing underperformance. Because one of the most common causes of underperformance, even you read about, how do we work or where do we work, what's the expectation? People can look around and say, oh, well, they work that way, therefore I'm going to do that. But there may be different reasons for them. And if it's not documented, people make up their own reality based on what they see or don't see. It's interesting because I did a facilitation last week with a scale up business that's growing rapidly, and the purpose of that was to get them some clarity around people and performance. What their charter was, right? They're about how we're going to manage people, and so we were talking about that. And then also what came out of that was they also had a need to be clearer about communication, how they were going to do communication, and also project management. And so through this kind of thing, you can realize that as they've grown, it became blurry and people are confused. And so all of these things were like, it's almost like a handbook of how we need to behave. And just by capturing that, it gives you something to come back to or to identify where you've gone astray, and people know where they stand. So it sounds like a really important thing to do in this stage, isn't it? And maybe redefine as well as companies go through one stage to the next.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's scary how many people aren't aligned to goals, objectives, don't understand what their company's goals or objectives are, don't understand how their performance is assessed. And I see this on the other side of the fence. Probably the number one topic that comes up in terms of HR people leaders in our network asking for help and support is around the topic of performance. People don't know the best way to assess performance in organizations. No one really has done an incredible job out there actually of really standardizing what that should look like and what good looks like. So that topic on itself hasn't been solved by companies. So if they haven't solved it and they don't know how to assess people's performance, how do employees meant to operate around that? And how are you meant to feel aligned to goals and OKRs? And it's definitely broken, and that's no one's fault necessarily, but we need to find a way of getting something on paper so that people really start to understand how am I being assessed and what does that look like, whether it's right
They
or
need to
wrong.
get some software like Actus and put the goals in and evaluate it against it.
Yeah.
But it's so true, because often with the founder leader, and again, as businesses grow, that person who is often an ideasy, creative, entrepreneurial person isn't necessarily going to be the person who's going to put in structure and clarity, and they may know exactly where the business is going and it's in their head. But they probably have lots of new ideas, so you have conflicting priorities, so people become confused. So even if they are sharing those goals, which often they're not, they think they are because they're very clear to them, they're not cascading them. People don't see where they are, or people feel that things change too frequently, so they become confused because there's always something new happening or is new priority. And now those are really common challenges and understandable in smaller businesses, but that is why it's so important to start defining, well, this is how we manage performance, this is how we, telling the managers what's expected and the individuals what's expected, so that you can kind of bring it together. And I can totally see how that links to trust. So you're very much about communication and capturing it and documenting it. And it's interesting, you can talk a little bit about the transparency charter. I've certainly worked with businesses. That's what we were doing last night, was a people performance management charter. Talk to me about your transparency charter. Or your
So people can call that whatever they want as well. They don't have to use the same name. We've actually evolved the name a little bit from like transparency policy, philosophy, whatever works for you. But charter we quite like. But at its essence, it's effectively helping to decide and define what that word means in your business. And it won't mean everything to everyone. Lots of companies will operate without that word being used, but we are seeing a lot more companies in the last 5 years start pulling in things like openness, transparency, trust to their company values. And that's happening a lot more at the moment, but companies aren't defining what that word actually means. So it's just an empty value, an empty word on a page, and it means different things to different people. And I do this exercise a lot, is get people to tell me what that word means in a group, and you get lots of different answers. And that sort of answers that sort of point for me immediately, is like, you have to take a moment to tell the world and tell your employees what this word means. So transparency charter is really an overarching basis, will help to tell your employees, but also your future employees, what does this word mean here? Why do we use it? Why has it got meaning to us? But also, if you do it properly as an exercise, helps you to define as a business what you do and don't share. What do you lean into? What do you maybe not lean into? How deep do you go on that, and why? And other things that you don't share and why. And not many companies do this, I should point out. It's not a mainstream done thing yet, hopefully one day. But aside from getting people aligned and on the same page and managing expectations with employees around what they should hear about and not hear about, it's a really, really healthy compass for you in the future when you come up against situations that are maybe new to you. And this happens a lot in startups and scale ups and SMEs who are learning as they go. You've got something to refer back to, so you don't have to panic as a leadership team and say, oh, what do we do? How do we handle this situation? Everyone's running around like headless chickens. You've got something you can refer back to say, right, what does this tell us? We agreed on this as a team. We built it out as a team. How should we handle this situation when it comes to communicating with the employees and with the wider world maybe? And it acts as that guide for you in the future as well. So without going too deep on that now, it's something that we encourage a lot of our members to do if they are taking transparency seriously. If they're a business that is using that word a lot, it's definitely something that I would look to see in companies in the future that are publicly shared, so that you can see that from the outside.
It's a signal. It signals intent, doesn't it? And I think that's the point. So if someone comes in and we've got transparency charge, and they think, oh, I'm being lied. It's like, well, I'm being lied. If people feel that they're not trusting something, it may be signals that I'm going to go and talk to someone about this, as opposed to just assume that they're not transparent because there's an intent there. Doesn't mean that issues won't arise. And I guess that's actually something worth going on to. So if you are in an organization trying to build trust and transparency and documenting various communications like we've discussed, what are the typical challenges? What are the obstacles that people have to navigate?
There's anxious C-suite, I would say, is probably the number one. It's not always CEO, actually. Often that plays a factor, but more so than anything, I tend to see it's like CFOs who are the ones that tense up at the idea.
They're worried about wage inflation because you've brought someone in who is the top talent from somewhere else, and they're earning 20 grand more than anyone else. So
they see the P&L, they panic that this word means that suddenly we're asking to share every line of the P&L with the entire world, and bonuses and how that's done, and so they tense up a lot of that. But again, transparency goes way wider than pay and compensation, and is a much broader topic than the CFO should be focusing on. So it's getting past, or getting the C-suite on board as a whole, which is always a challenge, but also educating them a little bit on what does this mean outside of pay, and why are we talking about doing this, and what are the problems that we see at the moment. So if you can overcome those challenges, I think that's a really big obstacle and hurdle. The next is understanding what good looks like, and that's something that we saw when we were looking at launching OpenOrg. We spent a long time speaking to, I want to say, hundreds of people leaders in different companies about the topic of transparency and why it wasn't being done. And every single HR people leader you speak to says, of course, I'd like to. No, none of them, they all believe in it, and they want to do the right thing. But they don't know what good looks like. They don't always have the support of the leadership team. And most of the people we spoke to were in that sort of lean or lone role, and they said, we don't have the support around us to soundboard, to think about what we could do. So again, tangible was the word that came out of that, and that was the task that we had to go away and solve, was how can we make transparency tangible. And without, again, going too deep on that now, we created something at OpenOrg as part of our IP, which is what we call the Open Culture Framework. And it's a framework that is free on our website now. Anyone can go and use that as a template and look at it and use it. But it's a guide. It helps you understand, where are we being open and transparent across our employee journeys and touch points with employees? Where are our gaps? Where are our opportunities to do more, lean into more? And how can we tie some of these things to current problems we're having? And so that again is a way of being able to take a step forward and overcome that challenge. But tied to that, we offer loads of curated open resources, examples of what other companies are doing publicly to do some great things around compensation and pay and career development and flexible working. So if you're a people person struggling for ideas and inspiration, that's a big part of what OpenOrg does, is we've gone out and curated all of that.
Yes, because I saw some of those when you presented last week at the you've got some really nice examples, which we weren't going to hear, but I guess we'll direct people to your sites and they can go and get those, because it will give them some inspiration, for sure. So we've basically identified that there is an issue. We shouldn't hide it. So there is an issue. Solving it is going to improve productivity, engagement, generally people's well-being. I think if feeling in a trusting environment, take away that confusion. A lot of fixing is about just getting some clarity, consistency in documenting it and communicating stuff. A lot of that's how you avoid misunderstanding. In terms of the challenges, it doesn't have to be about money. If a CFO is right, there's other things and business cases there. So I suppose just to conclude, Adam, if for the people listening, people professionals probably listening who've got a million other challenges but think this is important, have you got like a few top tips that you'd say where to start? Obviously go and look at your site and get some inspiration. Any other top tips to take away?
Yeah, I'd say start soon. Honestly, I know that people are fighting fires and trying to solve things, but they're fires that could be avoided if you start tackling some of these problems. You're not being productive as a team or as a business if you just are focused on fighting fires. And I know those fires need to be fought, but start looking at preventative measures as well. And for me, I know there's other things that come into play, but transparency is something that can help impact positively all of these things around communication, engagement, trust. When you think about human nature, our relationships are built on trust and communication and transparency, and that continues in work just as it does in personal relationships and things like that as well. So no one can argue that, and for me, it's so important. But take that first step, start talking about what you're doing with transparency and communication. How can we do more, even if it's a baby step, and start identifying some really easy, basic, safe wins. And without, again, rambling on too much right now, there's, if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn, I'd happily share a few, but some really simple things about our working hours and where we work. Just get tight on some of those policies and documents, and because most companies aren't, from what I've seen, and people get confused, and that creates misalignment and a lot of problems, and that feeds into performance, and then there's the fires you need to fight again. So I think even though it can easily be pushed down the line, start looking at how you can prevent some of these fires, and that will free you up to be more proactive in the future.
And you can, if you decide them early and get them documented early, and that's the way we work around here, you establish it as a culture that will be with you as you grow, as opposed to having to go, hang on, it's broken and it's a bit more complicated to bring back together, because you've then got to pull people back from a different set of behaviours. Whereas if you can grow with that mindset and those principles, it's going to make a difference.
But
Great.
One big final tip for me, which a lot of people sort of say, which I feel is a little bit of like not an excuse, but a lot of people say, well, we can't document this because we don't have it in place yet, or we don't have that in place. My advice is always, if you don't have a career development framework in place, document that and tell people that and be open about that. That sets expectations. The problem that I see is companies don't have something in place yet, but they'll try and pretend they do, or that it's going to be there in a minute, and that again gives people the wrong impression. So just be very clear about what we have got and what we haven't got. Document it, be honest about it, and people can accept that, and it gives you some breathing space as well.
Totally. We could totally go off down the career aspirations and talent management. If it almost opens up that problem, we'll save that for another day, because that is a great example of something where people think, how do these things happen? But the point is, don't make it up. Just accept where you are, be clear, open and honest, and people will trust you, and you're going on a journey. Most businesses are going on a journey in terms of those things. So Adam, you've already said people can reach out to you on LinkedIn. Adam Horne, we'll put in the show notes to reach out to you, and also we'll put access to OpenOrg in the show notes too. So thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast. It's a really thought-provoking topic, so I'm very grateful to you.
No, thanks for inviting me. It's been awesome, and love chatting about it.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.